Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. My name is Marcus Thompson, and at 6:47 a.m. on October 13th, 2018, my radio crackled with the call that would plunge me into a nightmare I'm still trying to forget. Unit 47, we have a code yellow. Missing hiker reported at Shenandoah National Park. Dispatcher Sarah's voice cut through the morning static. 22-year-old female Hannah Williams, last seen yesterday evening on the Appalachian Trail near Skyline Mile 57. My coffee grew cold in my hands as I fumbled for my notepad, my 3-month rookie badge still gleaming on my freshly pressed uniform. The Williams family had called at dawn, voices cracking with panic after Hannah failed to return from what should have been a simple day hike. Mrs. Williams sobbed through the phone about her daughter's responsible nature. Always checked in, always carried extra water, never took unnecessary risks. Hannah had texted her location at 4:30 p.m. the previous day. Beautiful views at Stormy Summit, heading back down soon. That was 16 hours ago, and the autumn temperature had dropped to a bone-chilling 38 degrees overnight. I strapped on my 30-pound search pack, checking my gear with the obsessive precision of someone desperate to prove himself worthy of the Ranger badge. Garmin GPS 60 fully charged. Motorola APX 7000 radio, fresh batteries, first aid kit, emergency bivvy, headlamp, backup flashlight. My hands trembled slightly, not from cold, but from the weight of responsibility settling on my shoulders like a lead blanket. The Appalachian Trail wound through dense Virginia hardwood forest, autumn leaves creating a carpet of crimson and gold that muffled my footsteps. I'd memorized every map of this section during training, but walking it alone felt different, more alive, more watchful. The morning air carried the earthy scent of decomposing leaves mixed with something else, something that made my nostrils flare with unease. At 8:15 a.m., I reached Hannah's last known GPS coordinates near Stormy Summit. Her footprints were clearly visible in the muddy trail. Size 8 Merrell hiking boots, distinctive tread pattern. I photographed them with my department-issued Canon PowerShot, noting how the impressions showed she'd been moving at a normal walking pace, not running or stumbling. But then, at mile marker 57.3, her tracks simply stopped. I keyed my radio with sweaty palms. Base Unit 47. I'm at the subject's LKP, GPS coordinates 38.5951 again, 78.3775 degrada W. Found clear boot prints terminating abruptly at mile marker 57.3. No signs of struggle, but tracks end with no explanation. Requesting K9 unit for scent tracking. The radio crackled back. Copy that, 47. K9 unit ETA 45 minutes. Continue preliminary search pattern. Following department protocol, I began cutting sign and expanding circles around Hannah's last footprint. The forest felt wrong. Too quiet, too still. No bird calls, no squirrel chatter. Just the oppressive silence of a woodland holding its breath. My skin prickled with the sensation of being watched, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder every few minutes, seeing nothing but endless trees stretching into shadow. That's when I heard it. A woman's voice calling faintly through the trees. "Help! Please, someone help me!" My heart hammered against my ribs as I crashed through the underbrush toward the sound, thorns tearing at my uniform. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the tree trunks in a way that made my head spin. I emerged into a small clearing where an elderly woman sat beside a broken-down Subaru Outback, its hood raised and steam rising from the engine. She looked to be in her 60s, gray hair pulled back in a neat bun, wearing a faded floral dress and sensible shoes. Tears streaked her weathered cheeks as she looked up at me with desperate relief. "Oh, thank God, a ranger," she gasped. "I've been stranded here since last night. My car overheated and my cell phone has no signal. I saw a young woman yesterday evening, pretty girl with a blue backpack. She said she'd send help when she reached the road, but no one came." My blood turned to ice water in my veins. "Ma'am, what time did you see this woman?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The description matched Hannah perfectly. Blue REI backpack, just like her mother had described. The woman, she introduced herself as Dorothy Brennan, wiped her eyes with a tissue from her purse. Around 5 o'clock, maybe 5:30. Sweet girl, said she was from Richmond. She looked tired, like she'd been hiking all day. I offered her some water from my cooler and she was so grateful. Dorothy gestured to a red Coleman cooler in her back seat. She said the trail markers were confusing, kept leading her in circles. Poor thing was all turned around. Something cold crawled up my spine like a spider. Hannah was an experienced hiker, had grown up in these mountains. She wouldn't get lost on a well-marked trail she'd hiked dozens of times. But Dorothy's story felt rehearsed, too neat, like lines from a script she'd memorized. My husband Bob went to find cell service about an hour ago, Dorothy continued, pointing deeper into the woods. Walked toward that old logging road over there. He should be back soon. Maybe he found that girl along the way. Would you mind helping an old lady get her car started? Bob's got a bad back and I worry about him walking too far in these woods. Every instinct screamed danger, but my rookie training emphasized civilian assistance. I couldn't leave an elderly woman stranded, especially with temperatures dropping. Of course, ma'am. Let me take a look at your engine. I approached the Subaru, noting how the engine block was completely cold despite the steam. Steam that smelled wrong, more like burning plastic than overheated coolant. You're so kind, dear, Dorothy said, moving closer behind me. Not many young men would stop to help these days. The world's gotten so cold, so suspicious, but you can tell a person's nature right away, can't you? Some people are born helpers, born good. Others, her voice trailed off in a way that made my shoulder blades tense. I pretended to examine the engine while discreetly keying my radio for an open channel, hoping Base would hear our conversation. Ma'am, this radiator hose looks like it was cut, not burst from pressure. Are you sure you broke down naturally? The question slipped out before I could stop myself, my suspicious nature overriding rookie politeness. Dorothy's entire demeanor changed in an instant. The tears dried up. The trembling stopped, and when she smiled, I saw that several of her teeth were filed to sharp points. Oh, you're a smart one, aren't you, Marcus? Much smarter than that sweet little Hannah girl. She believed every word I said, right up until we got her into the house. Terror flooded my system like liquid nitrogen. I'd never told her my name, and my badge was facing away from her. My hand flew to my radio, but Dorothy moved with inhuman speed, grabbing my wrist with fingers that felt like steel cables. Her grip was impossibly strong for a woman her age, and her nails had grown into black claws that punctured my skin. Bob, she called in a sing-song voice. We have another visitor, and this one's wearing a uniform. How delicious. Her voice had changed too, deeper now, with an accent I couldn't place. Something ancient and hungry lived behind her eyes, something that had been waiting in these woods for fresh prey. The sound of heavy footsteps crashed through the underbrush, and a man emerged from the trees. Bob Brennan looked normal enough at first glance. Overalls, work boots, graying beard. But his movements were wrong, too fluid, like a predator stalking prey. In his hands, he carried Hannah's blue REI backpack, and the front was soaked with something dark and wet. If this story is giving you chills, smash that follow button for more supernatural horror. What would you do in Marcus Thompson's situation? Comment below. Well, well, Bob grinned, revealing the same filed teeth as his wife. A baby ranger, still wet behind the ears. Dorothy, you always did have a talent for attracting the helpful ones. This boy's got that same eager look Hannah had, so desperate to do the right thing, to save everyone. He tossed the backpack at my feet, and I heard something heavy and wet slosh inside. My training kicked in despite the terror flooding my veins. I yanked my arm free from Dorothy's grasp, skin tearing on her claws, and grabbed my radio. Mayday, Mayday. Unit 47 requesting immediate backup at coordinates. Bob's fist connected with my jaw before I could finish, sending me sprawling across the forest floor. The metallic taste of blood filled my mouth as my radio skittered away into the leaves. Now that's not very polite, Dorothy tisked, circling me like a vulture. We were having such a nice conversation. Bob and I don't get many visitors this deep in the woods, especially not ones in uniform. The last ranger we met was... Oh, what was his name, dear? The one from 15 years ago? Ferguson, Bob replied, wiping Hannah's blood off his knuckles with a stained handkerchief. Officer David Ferguson. Lasted 3 whole days before he broke. Though he was a veteran, not fresh meat like this one. This boy'll snap much quicker. I can smell the fear sweating out of his pores. I scrambled backward, my spine hitting the rough bark of an oak tree. My service pistol was still holstered, but Bob had positioned himself directly in my line of fire to Dorothy. These weren't random killers. They moved with military precision, practiced teamwork born from years of hunting together. "Where is Hannah?" I demanded, trying to inject authority into my shaking voice. "What did you do to her?" But even as I asked, the answer was clear in the wet sounds coming from inside her backpack, in the satisfied gleam in their filed teeth, in the way they licked their lips when they looked at me. "Hannah's in a better place now," Dorothy giggled, the sound like breaking glass. "Well, pieces of her are. We shared her between us. Bob likes the tender bits while I prefer the parts that put up a fight. Don't worry, dear Marcus. We'll take good care of you too. We've been practicing our hospitality for decades in these woods." Bob reached into his overall pocket and withdrew a syringe filled with yellow liquid. "This'll make you nice and compliant, boy. Won't hurt much. Well, not until we get you back to the house. That's where the real fun begins. We've got Hannah's leftovers cooling in the cellar if you'd like to say goodbye properly." The forest spun around me as shock and horror battled for control of my nervous system. These things, because they clearly weren't human anymore, had been using their elderly appearance to lure victims for years. How many hikers had vanished in this section of the park? How many families had never gotten answers? I thought of my wife Sarah, 7 months pregnant with our first child, waiting at home with dinner in the oven. I'd promised her I'd be careful in my new job, that I'd come home safe every night. I thought of my mother so proud when I'd graduated Ranger Academy, how she'd cried when I got assigned to Shenandoah. I couldn't let them find my pieces scattered through these woods. Adrenaline flooded my system like rocket fuel. I rolled hard to my left just as Bob lunged with the syringe, the needle stabbing deep into the oak bark. Before he could recover, I drew my Glock 22 and put 3 rounds center mass into his chest. The .40 caliber hollow points should have dropped him instantly, but Bob just looked down at the bleeding holes and laughed. "Oh, you sweet summer child," he wheezed, black blood frothing from his lips. "You think a little gun can stop us? We've been feeding on lost souls so long we barely remember what it felt like to be human. Death is just another doorway for us now." Dorothy shrieked with rage and launched herself at me with inhuman speed, claws extended toward my throat. I emptied my magazine into her face and chest, each shot producing wet, meaty impacts, but barely slowing her down. Her ruined features began healing even as I watched, bones knitting back together, flesh regrowing with nauseating squelching sounds. I sprinted deeper into the forest, crashing through undergrowth as branches tore at my uniform and skin. Behind me, I could hear them giving chase, not running but moving with the patient persistence of predators who knew their prey was trapped in their territory. My radio was lost, my weapon empty, and I was deep in woods that these creatures had been hunting in for decades. The trees seemed to close in around me as I ran, branches reaching out like grasping fingers to snare my clothing. The autumn sun disappeared behind a wall of clouds, plunging the forest into premature twilight. My breathing came in ragged gasps, my rookie conditioning no match for the terror-fueled sprint through dense woodland. I stumbled into another clearing and my heart nearly stopped. There, nestled between ancient pines, stood a quaint little cottage with smoke curling from its chimney and warm light glowing in the windows. It looked like something from a fairy tale. Whitewashed walls, flower boxes, a red door with a brass knocker shaped like a smiling face. "Marcus!" Dorothy's voice called from the trees behind me. "Where are you going, dear? Don't run from us, we only want to help. Come back and let us take care of you properly." Her words dripped with false sweetness, but I could hear the hunger underneath, the promise of unspeakable things. The cottage door creaked open and a figure appeared in the doorway. Another elderly person, this time a man with kind eyes and a welcoming smile. "Come in, son," he called softly. "You look like you're in trouble. These woods can be dangerous at night, especially for someone alone." Every fiber of my being screamed that this was another trap, another predator wearing human skin. But exhaustion and terror had pushed me beyond rational thought. I could hear Bob and Dorothy crashing through the underbrush, getting closer with each passing second. The cottage offered the only shelter in sight. I staggered up the porch steps and through the red door, the elderly man closing it firmly behind me. The interior was warm and cozy, filled with the scent of baking bread and chamomile tea. Family photos covered the mantelpiece, showing decades of smiling faces at birthdays, holidays, graduations. It felt real, normal, human. "My name is Henry Morrison," the old man said, guiding me to a comfortable armchair by the fireplace. "I've lived in these woods for 30 years, and I know all about Bob and Dorothy Brennan. Nasty pieces of work, those two. Been preying on hikers since the late 1990s, maybe earlier." Relief flooded through my battered body. Finally, someone who could help. Someone who understood the horror I'd witnessed. Henry poured steaming tea into a delicate china cup and pressed it into my shaking hands. The warmth felt like salvation after the cold terror of the chase. "How many people have they killed?" I asked, taking a grateful sip of tea. It tasted strange, bitter underneath the sweetness, with an aftertaste that reminded me of copper pennies. My vision began to blur slightly around the edges, and my limbs felt suddenly heavy. "Oh, dozens," Henry replied, settling into the chair across from me with his own cup. "Maybe hundreds over the years. They're very good at what they do, choosing victims who won't be missed immediately, making the disappearances look like hiking accidents. The Park Service has no idea they have a breeding pair of cannibals in their woods." The teacup slipped from my numb fingers, shattering against the hardwood floor. Through my drug-hazed vision, I saw Henry's kind expression melting away like wax, revealing something ancient and hungry underneath. His teeth weren't filed like the others. They were needle-sharp, like a lamprey's mouth, designed for tearing and shredding. "You see, Marcus," Henry continued in a voice that was no longer entirely human. "Bob and Dorothy are just the appetizers. I'm the main course, so to speak. They drive the prey to me, and I feast on what remains after they've had their fun. It's a very efficient system, really. We've perfected it over decades of practice." I tried to stand, to run, to fight, but the drugged tea had turned my muscles to jelly. My vision tunneled as Henry rose from his chair, his human disguise sloughing away like a shed snakeskin. Underneath was something that should never have existed, a twisted fusion of man and something far older, far hungrier. "The lovely Hannah lasted quite a while," Henry mused, reaching for a leather case filled with surgical instruments. "She had such spirit, such determination to live. But even the strongest will breaks eventually. And when it does, oh, the flavors that emerge are simply exquisite." The cottage around me began to change as well, the cozy family home facade dissolving to reveal its true nature. The family photos became pictures of victims, dozens of smiling hikers who had trusted the wrong faces in the woods. The warm fireplace revealed itself as a cremation furnace, human bones scattered among the ashes. The smell of baking bread was actually the reek of roasting flesh. My radio suddenly crackled to life from somewhere in the cottage. They must have retrieved it from the forest floor. "Unit 47, this is base. GPS shows your location as..." "Wait, that can't be right. You're showing as inside the old Morrison place, but that's been abandoned for years." Marcus responded immediately. Henry chuckled as he selected a bone saw from his collection. "Oh, the cottage has been abandoned for a very long time. I just borrowed old Henry's skin after I ate the rest of him. Humans are so trusting when you wear the right face, say the right words. You all want so desperately to believe that help is coming, that someone cares." The front door exploded inward with a deafening crash, and Bob and Dorothy burst through the wreckage. But instead of the twisted predators from the forest, they now appeared as they truly were, something that had once been human long ago, before decades of feeding on lost souls had transformed them into living nightmares. "Henry, you old bastard," Dorothy cackled, her voice a sound like tearing metal. "You were supposed to wait for us. We want to watch the young ranger break. It's been so long since we had one in uniform." "And this one's special," Bob added, flexing claws that extended from his fingertips like switchblades. "He's got a pregnant wife at home, a mother who'll spend the rest of her life wondering what happened to her precious boy. That kind of anguish is seasoning you just can't buy." Through the drug haze clouding my thoughts, one terrible realization burned bright. No one was coming to save me. My GPS signal was being blocked somehow. My radio communications jammed. The Park Service would find my abandoned patrol vehicle tomorrow. Maybe my torn uniform scattered through the forest, but they'd never find the truth. I would become just another missing ranger, another cautionary tale about the dangers of working alone in the wilderness. But then something strange happened. As the three monsters closed in around my paralyzed form, I felt a warmth spreading through my chest that had nothing to do with the drugged tea. It was the memory of Sarah's hand on my face that morning as she kissed me goodbye. The promise I'd made to our unborn child to be the kind of father who always came home safe. "You made one mistake," I managed to whisper through my swollen, drug-numbed lips. The three creatures paused, curious about my final words. "You told me about the others, about Hannah, about Ferguson, about all the families who never got answers. But I'm not just a ranger. I'm a father. And fathers don't give up." The warmth in my chest exploded outward, burning away the drug's paralysis like sunlight scattering shadows. I'd never experienced anything like it before, a protective fury that transcended human limitations, powered by love for people I might never see again if I failed here and now. I rolled off the chair just as Henry's bone saw whistled through the air where my neck had been. My muscles screamed in protest, but determination overrode pain as I scrambled toward a window. Glass exploded around me as I crashed through, tumbling onto the cottage's wraparound porch. The three monsters pursued with inhuman shrieks of rage, no longer bothering with their human disguises. In the moonlight, I could see them as they truly were, things that had fed on human suffering for so long that they'd forgotten their own humanity entirely. I sprinted back into the forest, my second wind powered by desperation and love. But this time I wasn't running blindly. This time I had a plan. During my academy training, we'd studied a case from Oregon where a ranger had trapped a serial killer using the terrain itself as a weapon. The technique was risky, potentially suicidal, but it was the only chance I had. I led them toward Devil's Canyon, a deep ravine with crumbling limestone walls that was marked as hazardous on all park maps. The unstable rock face had claimed 3 lives over the years, but tonight it might save countless others by ending the hunting spree of these 3 abominations. The creatures followed my trail through the underbrush with predatory patience, savoring the hunt more than the eventual kill. They thought they had me cornered, that I was just another panicked victim leading them toward his own destruction. They had no idea I'd spent weeks studying every dangerous formation in this section of the park. At the canyon's edge, I turned to face them. 3 monsters that wore human faces like masks, their eyes glowing with an unholy hunger that could never be satisfied. "This ends here," I called out, my voice steady despite the fear coursing through my veins. "No more victims, no more families left wondering. I'm taking you all with me." "Noble sentiment," Henry laughed, his surgical tools glinting in the moonlight. "But you're just one man, and we've survived everything the forest could throw at us for decades. What makes you think—" I didn't let him finish. Instead, I pulled the emergency flare from my belt and ignited it, bathing the canyon in hellish red light. The sudden brightness revealed the true horror of what they'd become. Dorothy's face was a patchwork of different skin tones, stolen from victims over the years. Bob's hands were impossibly long, with additional joints that allowed his fingers to wrap around a human head like a basketball. Henry wasn't entirely solid anymore, shifting between human form and something that suggested too many teeth and not enough bones to hold them. "The thing about limestone," I said, backing toward the unstable canyon wall, "is that it's incredibly sensitive to vibration. One loud noise, one sharp impact, and entire sections can collapse." I held up my service weapon, reloaded with my spare magazine during the chase. These are .40 caliber hollow points designed to expand on impact and transfer maximum kinetic energy to the target. Their eyes widened as they finally understood my plan, but it was too late. I emptied the entire magazine into the canyon wall behind me, each shot sending spiderwebs of cracks racing through the limestone. The rock face groaned ominously, centuries of erosion and weather damage finally reaching a critical tipping point. "See you in hell," I whispered and stepped backward off the ledge. The world exploded into chaos as thousands of tons of limestone collapsed into Devil's Canyon. I fell with the rockslide, my body battered by stones and debris as the three monsters' inhuman screams echoed off the canyon walls. Pain erupted from a dozen different impacts, but underneath it all was a strange peace. I'd kept my promise to Sarah, to our unborn child, to all the families who deserved answers. Darkness claimed me as I tumbled through the avalanche, the last sound I heard being the wet crunch of ancient evil, finally meeting its end under tons of unforgiving stone. I woke up 3 days later in Shenandoah Valley Regional Hospital, my body wrapped in enough bandages to make me look like a mummy. Sarah was asleep in the chair beside my bed, her hand resting protectively on her swollen belly. Tears leaked from my eyes as I realized I'd actually survived, that I'd get to meet my child after all. The official report listed Hannah Williams as a victim of a hiking accident. Apparently her remains were found in the collapsed canyon, along with the bodies of 3 unidentified individuals who were believed to be responsible for a string of missing person cases dating back decades. The Park Service quietly updated their safety protocols and installed new emergency beacons throughout the area. But sometimes late at night when Sarah and our daughter Emma are asleep, I return to those woods in my dreams. I can still hear Dorothy's sing-song voice calling my name through the trees, still smell the reek of Henry's cottage as it revealed its true nature. The doctors say the nightmares will fade with time, but I know better. Some experiences leave scars on your soul that never fully heal. Some evils are so profound that they change the very air around them, leaving behind a wrongness that sensitive people can feel for generations. I've requested a transfer to a different park, somewhere far from the shadows of Shenandoah. But part of me will always be trapped in that cottage watching 3 monsters debate which pieces of me to eat first. The hardest part is knowing that there might be others out there, other false Samaritans wearing human faces, other families perfecting their hunting techniques in forests across the country. Every missing hiker case that crosses my desk now gets a second look. Every unexplained disappearance haunts my dreams. But I survived, and Hannah Williams's family finally got their answers. Sometimes that's all a ranger can do, stand between the darkness and the innocent, even when the cost threatens to destroy everything you hold dear. My name is Marcus Thompson, and I learned that evil often comes disguised as kindness, offering help with one hand while reaching for a knife with the other. Trust carefully in the deep woods. Not everyone who offers aid has your best interests at heart. Holy hell, that was intense. Did that ending blow your mind? Like, if you want more terrifying ranger stories, follow for daily supernatural horror. And comment your theory about what really happened to Hannah Williams in that canyon. I read every single one. My name is Anthony Martinez, and I should have forgotten the case of Jennifer Martinez. But something brought me back to that cursed forest where the trails never end and the dead still walk their rounds. 3 months had passed since Jennifer vanished without a trace from the Cascade National Forest, and officially, the case was cold as the October frost that now painted the Douglas firs in crystalline death. But last Tuesday, a hiker found her Timex watch, the one with the cracked face and pink wristband, hanging from a Douglas fir branch exactly 2.3 miles deeper into the forest than our grid search had ever reached. The metal band was bent in ways that suggested violent removal, and there were scratches on the face that spelled out coordinates: 47 to 47 33N, 121 to go 815W. I'd been a forest ranger for 18 years, and in those 18 years I'd pulled 37 bodies out of these mountains. Hypothermia, falls, bear attacks, heart attacks. I'd seen every way the wilderness could claim a human life. But Jennifer's case gnawed at my gut like a tapeworm, eating away at my professional confidence with each sleepless night. The 22-year-old college student had simply vanished from the well-traveled Cascade River Trail at 3:47 p.m. on a clear July afternoon, leaving behind only her North Face day pack and a single Nike hiking boot with the laces still tied. The coordinates from the watch led to Section 7G, a remote area that old-timers called Martinez's Beat, named after Sergeant Eduardo Martinez, a forest ranger who died in those woods back in 1987 during a routine patrol. No relation to me, despite the shared surname. But the coincidence had always felt like cold fingers tracing my spine. Eduardo had been found 3 days after he'd radioed his last position check, his body twisted around a Douglas fir trunk like he'd been running in circles until exhaustion claimed him. The official report blamed disorientation and exposure, but the unofficial stories whispered about Eduardo's radio log, how he'd reported walking the same stretch of trail for 6 hours, growing increasingly panicked as familiar landmarks repeated in impossible sequence. Now, as I stood at the trailhead at 5:47 hours on a Wednesday morning in October 2018, adjusting the weight of my 72-hour pack and checking my Garmin eTrex GPS unit for the 4th time, I could taste the metallic tang of fear, mixing with the stale coffee and protein bar I'd forced down for breakfast. My service radio crackled with the morning roll call from base station, each ranger checking in with their assigned sectors and weather reports, their voices a comforting thread of normalcy that would soon fray into static and screams. Unit 47, Martinez, beginning patrol of Section 7G, GPS coordinates 47-4715 N, 121 degree or 758 W. I radioed, my breath visible in the 42-degree air. Weather clear, visibility good. Beginning search pattern Alpha 7 for evidence related to the Jennifer Martinez case. Copy that, Tony, came dispatch's voice through the speaker, crackling with the kind of static that made me think of old horror movies. You're going solo today. Rodriguez called in sick and Thompson's handling that SAR operation on Mount Pilchuck. Check in every 2 hours, and don't be a hero if weather turns. The trail began normally enough. Well-maintained path with orange blazes every 50 yards, the kind of route that saw hundreds of hikers during peak season. My Danner boots crunched through a carpet of maple leaves painted in shades of rust and gold, and the familiar weight of my gear. Radio on my left hip, Leatherman multi-tool on my right, first aid kit and emergency shelter in my pack, provided the comforting rhythm that had anchored me through nearly 2 decades of backcountry work. But as I hiked deeper into the forest following the coordinates toward Jennifer's watch location, the woods began to feel wrong in ways my rational mind couldn't quite catalog. The bird songs died first, not gradually, like when a predator moves through the area, but all at once as if someone had flipped a switch and muted the forest's natural soundtrack. The silence pressed against my eardrums with an almost physical weight, broken only by the crunch of my boots and the whisper of wind through branches that cast shadows in patterns that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. My skin prickled with the sensation of being watched, and twice I spun around with my hand on my radio, expecting to see another hiker or maybe a curious black bear, but finding only the empty trail stretching behind me like a brown tongue leading back toward civilization. At 07:23 hours I reached the coordinates. The Douglas fir where Jennifer's watch had been found stood exactly where my GPS indicated, but something was wrong with the tree itself. The bark was scarred in long, parallel grooves that looked like claw marks, but no animal I knew could score wood that deeply. More disturbing were the other marks, circular patches where the bark had been stripped away in perfect spirals, creating patterns that reminded me of ancient Celtic knots or the kind of symbols you'd see carved into asylum walls by madmen. At the base of the tree, the ground was disturbed in a way that suggested something heavy had been dragged in circles, wearing a groove in the earth that formed a perfect ring around the trunk. I photographed everything with my department-issued Canon camera, the digital display showing the timestamp and GPS coordinates for each shot. But when I reviewed the images on the camera's LCD screen, the photos showed only normal forest floor and unblemished bark. I took 17 more shots, checking after each one, but the camera seemed incapable of capturing the obvious damage I could see with my naked eyes. My hands started shaking as I lowered the camera, and I noticed that my pulse had jumped to what felt like 120 beats per minute, the kind of heart rate I'd normally hit after jogging uphill for 20 minutes. That's when I heard Jennifer's voice calling for help somewhere deeper in the forest. The sound drifted through the trees like smoke, faint but unmistakably human, a young woman's voice crying, Help me! Please! Somebody help me! From what sounded like maybe half a mile to the northwest. Every instinct I'd developed as a ranger screamed at me to respond immediately. This was what I'd trained for, what I'd dedicated my career to, finding lost people and bringing them home safely. But something about the voice felt wrong, like an echo of an echo, or like hearing someone speak underwater. I keyed my radio. Unit 47 to dispatch. I have possible contact with missing person Jennifer Martinez. Coordinates 47 to 4733N, 121 degree 0815W. Voice contact only. Investigating now. Static answered me. Complete white noise static that made my radio sound like it was trying to tune in stations from Mars. I adjusted the squelch, checked my battery indicator, full charge, and tried again. Nothing but electronic snow. My cell phone showed the same story. No service in bold letters where the signal bars should be, even though I'd had 3 bars when I'd parked at the trailhead. The voice called again, closer now but still from the northwest, and this time I could make out words. Please, I'm hurt, I can't move, help me. The tone was urgent but controlled, not the kind of panic-driven shrieking I'd expect from someone who'd been missing for 3 months. It sounded more like someone reading lines from a script, hitting all the right notes but missing the genuine desperation that comes with real terror. I followed the voice deeper into Section 7G, my boots squelching through patches of ground that felt too soft, too wet for the dry October weather we'd been having. The trail here was narrower, marked with faded yellow blazes that seemed to flicker in my peripheral vision like dying fireflies. Twice I stopped to check my GPS, and both times the display showed coordinates that placed me in the middle of Cascade Lake, which was impossible, since the lake was 15 miles south of my actual position. The voice led me in a roughly circular pattern, always staying just out of sight beyond the next ridge or around the next bend in the trail. After an hour of following the calls for help, I began to recognize landmarks. A distinctive lightning-struck cedar, a boulder shaped like a sleeping bear, a creek crossing where the water ran uphill in defiance of basic physics. I was walking the same section of trail over and over again, but somehow never reaching my starting point, as if the forest had become a Mobius strip of dirt and stone and shadow. If this story is giving you chills, smash that follow button for more supernatural horror. What would you do in Tony's situation? Comment below. My mouth tasted like copper pennies and fear sweat, and I could feel my rational mind starting to fray around the edges like a rope under too much tension. The voice kept calling, "Help me! I'm so cold, please don't leave me." But now it seemed to be coming from multiple directions at once, creating an impossible chorus of Jennifer Martinez's crying out from the darkness between the trees. My veteran's confidence, built on 18 years of successful rescues and professional competence, crumbled like wet cardboard as I realized I was trapped in something that shouldn't exist outside of fever dreams and campfire stories. At 11:34 hours, I encountered Eduardo Martinez for the first time. He was standing in the middle of the trail about 50 yards ahead, wearing the green and khaki uniform of a forest ranger circa 1987, the old-style campaign hat and leather gear that had been phased out years before I joined the service. Even at a distance, I could see that his uniform was wrong in fundamental ways, too clean for someone who'd been dead for 31 years, but also somehow rotted, with dark stains that might have been blood or might have been something worse spreading from hidden wounds. His face was pale as birch bark, and when he turned to look at me, his eyes were holes that went deeper than any human skull should allow. "You shouldn't be here, Martinez," he said, and his voice carried clearly across the distance despite being little more than a whisper. "This is my beat. I've been walking my beat since 1987 and I don't appreciate company." I tried to key my radio, but my hands were shaking so badly that I couldn't work the controls. Eduardo began walking toward me with a gait that was wrong in ways that made my hindbrain scream warnings. Too fluid, like his joints bent in directions human joints weren't designed to bend, and with each step he took, the trail behind him seemed to stretch and multiply, creating forks and branches that led away into forest that grew darker and more twisted with each footfall. "Jennifer Martinez," I managed to croak through a throat that felt like it was coated in sawdust. "Where is Jennifer Martinez?" Eduardo's lipless mouth stretched into something that might have been a smile if you'd never seen a real smile before. "She's walking with me now, Martinez. walking her beat, walking my beat, walking the beat that never ends, round and round and round until the soles wear through your boots and your feet wear through to bone, and your bone wears through to nothing but the need to keep walking. That's when I saw Jennifer. She emerged from the trees behind Eduardo, like a figure stepping out of a black and white photograph. Her hiking clothes shredded and stained with substances that looked too dark to be mud and too thick to be water. Her face was the color of old parchment, and her eyes, God help me, her eyes were the same bottomless holes that Eduardo wore, as if something had reached into their skulls and scooped out everything that had ever made them human, leaving only hollow spaces that hungry darkness could live in. She moved with the same impossible fluidity as Eduardo, and as she walked I could see that her feet weren't quite touching the ground, as if she was suspended by invisible wires, or walking on a surface that existed just slightly above the reality I occupied. When she spoke, her voice was the same one that had been calling for help, but now it carried undertones of something vast and patient and utterly inhuman.
"Welcome to our beat, Ranger Martinez," she said, and her words seemed to echo from multiple directions at once. "We've been so lonely here, walking and walking and walking, but now you can walk with us. Walk with us forever, round and round until your bones forget what stillness feels like, and your soul forgets what it means to rest." I tried to run.
God help me. I tried to run, but my legs felt like they were moving through quicksand, and every step I took seemed to carry me further into the forest instead of back toward the trailhead. The trail beneath my boots began to change, sprouting new branches and offshoots that led in directions that hurt to look at directly. Behind me I could hear Eduardo and Jennifer following at their own measured pace, their footsteps perfectly synchronized like a funeral march played at half speed. My pack felt like it was filled with concrete blocks instead of survival gear, and my breathing came in ragged gasps that tasted like grave dirt and despair. The forest around me grew darker and more twisted with each passing minute, the Douglas firs and maples giving way to trees that looked like they'd grown from human bones and shadows. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in the space of a heartbeat, and I could see my breath forming ice crystals that fell like snow made of tiny knives. "There's no way out of Section 7G, Martinez," Eduardo called from somewhere behind me, his voice echoing from every tree trunk and stone. "I learned that the hard way in 1987. Been learning it every day since. Now you get to learn it too. You and Jennifer and me, walking the beat together, walking the beat forever." I stumbled over roots that moved under my feet like sleeping snakes, fell face first into ground that felt like it was made of bone meal and hair, scrambled back to my feet with hands that came away black with something that smelled like rotting flowers and copper pennies. My uniform was torn in places I couldn't remember tearing it, and I could feel warm liquid running down my face from cuts that shouldn't exist. That's when I saw the truth that nearly shattered what was left of my sanity. The trail wasn't just repeating, it was alive. The dirt path writhed under my boots like the hide of some massive subterranean creature, and the trees that lined the route weren't rooted in earth, but in flesh that pulsed with a heartbeat slow and steady as the rhythm of geological time. The trail markers weren't blazes painted on bark, but symbols carved into what looked like massive ribs, and the distances between them stretched and contracted like the forest was breathing. Eduardo and Jennifer weren't just trapped here, they had become part of it. They were antibodies in the forest's immune system, white blood cells tasked with processing intruders like me, breaking them down and incorporating them into the endless loop that had once been called Ranger Eduardo Martinez's patrol beat. This wasn't just a haunted trail. It was a living entity that fed on the souls of anyone unlucky enough to wander into its digestive tract. I could feel it trying to digest me, trying to break down my memories and personality and independent will, trying to reduce me to just another ranger walking his beat for eternity. My thoughts grew sluggish and repetitive, and I found myself reciting radio protocols from my academy training. Unit 47 to dispatch, beginning patrol. Unit 47 to dispatch, beginning patrol. Unit 47 to dispatch, beginning patrol. But somewhere in the dissolving mess of my consciousness, I held on to two things. The photograph in my wallet of my wife Maria making pancakes on Sunday morning, and the memory of Jennifer Martinez's mother crying over the phone 3 months ago, begging me to find her daughter and bring her home. Those two anchors, love for the living and duty to the lost, kept me from surrendering completely to the trail's digestive process. I pulled out my emergency flare gun, a piece of gear I'd carried for 18 years without ever firing. The 12-gauge shell contained magnesium and phosphorus designed to burn at 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit for 60 seconds, hot enough to melt aluminum and bright enough to be seen from 10 miles away. If this trail was alive, if it was flesh and blood and nightmare given form, maybe fire could hurt it. I aimed at the base of the largest tree, the one that looked like it was made of fused spinal columns, and pulled the trigger. The flare hit the trunk and exploded in a shower of burning magnesium that turned the forest noon bright for a split second. The tree let out a scream that sounded like every lost hiker who had ever died alone in the wilderness, and the trail beneath my feet convulsed like a wounded animal. Eduardo and Jennifer stopped walking and turned to look at me with expressions of what might have been surprise if their faces had retained enough humanity to display emotion. "That won't work, Martinez," Eduardo said, but for the first time, his voice carried a note of uncertainty. "Fire can't hurt what's already dead." I fired my second flare at the trail itself, the one that turned to magnesium-bright fire where the shell struck the ground. The living path writhed and twisted, and for a moment I could see through the illusion to what lay beneath. Not earth and stone, but miles of human hair braided together and soaked in blood that had turned black with age. The fire spread along the hair trail like fuse cord, burning away 31 years of accumulated nightmare and revealing glimpses of the original forest beneath. That's when I started running for real, my legs finally responding to my will instead of the trail's hunger. Behind me, I could hear Eduardo screaming orders in a voice that was no longer human. "Stay on the beat! Stay on the beat! No one leaves the beat!" The burning trail began to collapse behind me like a house of cards made of bone and shadow, and I could feel the forest's grip on reality loosening with each step I took toward what I hoped was still the real world. My GPS flickered back to life, showing coordinates that actually corresponded to my physical location, and my radio crackled with dispatch trying to raise me for my missed check-in. I reached the trailhead at 16:47 hours, stumbling out of the tree line like a drunk man trying to walk a straight line. My uniform was torn and stained with substances I didn't want to identify, and I'd lost my hat and my pack somewhere in the nightmare forest. But I was alive, and I was myself, and the parking lot looked beautifully, wonderfully normal under the October afternoon sun. "Unit 47 to dispatch," I radioed, surprised to find that my voice still worked. "Exiting Section 7G, negative contact on missing person Jennifer Martinez. Request crime scene unit to process evidence at coordinates 47, degree 4733N, 121 grade 15W. "Copy that, Tony. You sound rough. Everything okay out there?" I looked back at the forest where the trees stood innocent and still in the autumn light, showing no sign of the living hell that had tried to claim me. But I could see scorch marks on some of the trunks, and the air still smelled faintly of burning hair and magnesium. "Yeah," I said, "everything's fine. But I'm recommending we close Section 7G to public access pending further investigation." That was 6 months ago. Section 7G remains closed ostensibly for ecological restoration, and no one has reported any more missing hikers in that area. But sometimes, on quiet nights when I'm trying to sleep, I can still hear Jennifer Martinez calling for help from somewhere in the darkness between waking and dreaming. And sometimes, I wake up to find dirt under my fingernails and pine needles in my hair, as if part of me is still walking that endless beat with Eduardo and Jennifer, round and round and round until the end of time. My name is Anthony Martinez, and I should have forgotten the case of Jennifer Martinez. But some cases never close, and some trails never really end. They just wait for the next ranger to walk their beat. Holy hell, that was intense. Did that ending blow your mind? Like, if you want more terrifying ranger stories, follow for daily supernatural horror. And comment your theory about what really happened to Jennifer Martinez in Section 7G. I read every single one. My name is Luke Patterson, and the broken voice of Noah Bennett's mother on the phone still echoes in my head like a prayer that God refuses to answer. "Please, Luke," she had sobbed at 11:47 p.m., her words cutting through the static of my old Nokia flip phone. The other rangers gave up, but I know you won't. You're the only one who actually thinks about these cases. The metallic taste of fear had already begun coating my tongue, as something primal in my gut whispered that this wasn't going to be just another missing hiker case. It had been 72 hours since 19-year-old Noah Bennett had vanished from the Whispering Pines Trail in Pine Ridge National Forest, and every second that ticked by felt like another nail being hammered into his coffin. The kid had been on a solo photography expedition, documenting the autumn foliage for his college portfolio, when he simply disappeared. No distress calls on his satellite phone, no blood trail, no torn clothing caught on branches, just his expensive Canon 5D Mark IV camera found smashed against a Douglas fir tree, the memory card mysteriously wiped clean. The other rangers had chalked it up to a bear attack or a fall into one of the hidden ravines, but the mathematical part of my brain that earned me the nickname Calculator Patterson kept screaming that the numbers didn't add up. I'd spent the last 6 years being the ranger that other rangers rolled their eyes at during briefings, the guy who quoted statistics about search patterns and probability matrices while they relied on gut instincts and 30 years of experience. But when kids went missing and families started crying, suddenly everyone wanted Luke Patterson's detailed analysis and his obsessive attention to the data that others overlooked. The irony tasted bitter as day-old coffee as I strapped on my 40-pound pack at 4:23 a.m., checking my GPS coordinates one final time. 46 dig fit 42.3 N, 120 dig I 5318.7 W, the exact spot where Noah's camera had been discovered, where something had gone terrifyingly wrong. The October air cut through my Carhartt jacket like frozen razors as I clicked on my Streamlight ProTac HL headlamp, the LED beam slicing through the pre-dawn darkness that seemed thicker than usual, almost hungry. My radio crackled to life. Unit 17, this is base station. What's your 20? Sarah's voice, steady and professional, grounded me for a moment. Base station, Unit 17 is beginning secondary sweep of grid section Charlie 7, coordinates 46 degree 15D 42.3 N, 120 D 53 Bart 18. Evan W., I responded, following protocol even though every instinct in my analytical mind was screaming that protocol wasn't going to save Noah Bennett from whatever had taken him. The silence that followed felt pregnant with something darker than just the absence of sound. My boots crunched through the frost-brittle leaves, each step echoing with an unnatural sharpness that made the hair on the back of my neck stand at attention. The familiar smells of pine needles and decaying organic matter were still there, but underneath them lurked something else. Something sweet and cloying that reminded me of the funeral home where my grandfather had been laid out when I was 12. I'd been walking for exactly 47 minutes when I found the first anomaly, a child's sneaker size 3, partially buried under a pile of maple leaves that looked like they'd been deliberately arranged. The shoe was pristine white, like it had just come out of the box, but the date stamped on the sole read 1987, 31 years old and somehow still spotless. The logical part of my brain that had earned me a degree in forestry and wildlife management tried to rationalize the find. Some family had been camping decades ago, lost the shoe, and the forest had preserved it through some freak combination of environmental factors. But as I knelt down to photograph the evidence with my department-issued digital camera, my hands started trembling in a way that had nothing to do with the 34-degree temperature. The shoe was warm to the touch, and when I lifted it, I could swear I heard the faint sound of children giggling somewhere in the distance, carried on a wind that made the trees whisper secrets I didn't want to understand. Base station, Unit 17, I spoke into my radio, trying to keep my voice steady and professional despite the fact that my heart was hammering against my ribs like a woodpecker on methamphetamines. I've found potential evidence at coordinates 46 degree 1541 Tate N, 120 degree 5320.1 W, appears to be a child's shoe, vintage, requesting evidence collection team. The response was immediate. Unit 17, evidence team is 3 hours out, secure the scene, and continue sweep. 3 hours might as well have been 3 years if Noah was still alive and bleeding somewhere in these 89,000 acres of wilderness that suddenly felt like a mouthful of sharp teeth. I marked the location with orange survey tape and pressed deeper into the forest, following my predetermined search pattern while trying to ignore the way the shadows seemed to move independently of the wind. My GPS showed I was approaching the old logging road that hadn't been used since the 1990s, when environmental protests had shut down the timber operations and left behind a network of abandoned service roads that most tourists never knew existed. It was there, at coordinates 46 degree 1535.2 N, 120 degree 53 45.9 W, that I found the second shoe, and this time there was something inside it that made my analytical mind shut down completely and surrender to pure primal terror. The tiny foot was still inside the sneaker, mummified and blackened with age, but the toenails had been painted with bright pink nail polish that couldn't have been more than a few days old. My camera's flash illuminated the scene 3 times before my shaking hands could manage to take a proper photograph, and in that strobing light, I saw something that defied every natural law I'd studied in my 5 years of college education. The foot was twitching, the blackened toes curling and uncurling like it was trying to walk away from its own death. The bile rose in my throat so fast I barely had time to turn my head before I was vomiting my morning coffee and granola bar all over a patch of innocent ferns. If this story is giving you chills, smash that follow button for more supernatural horror. What would you do in Luke Patterson's situation? Comment below. Wiping my mouth with the back of my fleece-lined glove, I forced myself to document the scene properly, even as every survival instinct inherited from a million years of human evolution screamed at me to run. But Noah Bennett was out here somewhere, and his mother's broken voice kept playing on repeat in my head. You're the only one who actually thinks about these cases. So I thought, and what I thought was that someone, or something, was collecting children's feet as trophies, and Noah might be the newest addition to this sick collection. The mathematical probability of finding 2 vintage children's shoes within a quarter-mile radius was approximately 0.03%, which meant this wasn't random, wasn't natural, and wasn't something that any ranger training manual had prepared me for. My radio squawked again. All units, be advised, we have reports of children's voices heard in Sector Delta 9, requesting any available units to investigate. Sector Delta 9 was exactly 2.3 miles northeast of my current position, and according to my topographical map, it included the ruins of the old Whispering Pines summer camp that had been abandoned after the incidents in the 1980s. Every local knew the stories, the whispered rumors about children who had disappeared during a camp session in August 1987, how the camp had been shut down overnight and the records sealed by the state. But those were just stories, urban legends that got exaggerated with each telling around campfires and over beers at the local tavern. Except now I was staring at a child's foot that was still moving 31 years after death. And those stories were starting to feel like historical documentation. I marked the second shoe with GPS coordinates and more orange tape, then began moving towards Sector Delta 9 with my service weapon drawn. Not that my .40 caliber Smith & Wesson would do much good against whatever force could animate dead tissue. The forest around me had gone completely silent. Not even the rustle of small mammals or the distant call of a hawk to break the oppressive quiet. My footsteps seemed to echo with supernatural volume, and twice I spun around with my gun raised, convinced I'd heard someone, something, following just outside the range of my vision. The old camp came into view at 7:42 a.m., a collection of rotting wooden buildings arranged around a central fire pit that was surrounded by small log benches. The main lodge had partially collapsed, its roof caved in by decades of snow load and neglect. But the smaller cabins were still intact, their windows dark and empty like dead eyes staring out at the forest. And it was there, sitting on one of the log benches as if waiting for the camp counselor to call them to breakfast, that I saw the first child. She couldn't have been more than 7 years old, with blonde hair and pigtails, and a summer camp t-shirt that read, Whispering Pines, 1987. Her face was turned away from me, but I could see that she was swinging her legs back and forth in the universal rhythm of childhood impatience. My rational mind screamed that this was impossible, that no child could have survived alone in these woods for 31 years, but the evidence of my eyes was undeniable. She was real, she was there, and she was humming a tune that sounded familiar, something I'd heard on the oldies station my grandmother used to play. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking like I was 13 again and trying to ask Jennifer Morrison to the school dance. "Are you okay? Are you hurt?" The little girl stopped swinging her legs but didn't turn around. Instead, she raised one small hand and beckoned for me to come closer. Her gesture so perfectly innocent that I took 3 steps forward before my survival instincts kicked in and screamed at me to stop. Something was wrong with her silhouette. Something about the way her head sat on her shoulders like it wasn't quite attached properly. "My name is Luke Patterson," I continued, holstering my weapon and trying to project the calm, authoritative presence they'd taught us in child psychology training. "I'm a park ranger and I'm looking for someone. Have you seen a young man about 19 with dark hair? He had a camera?" The girl's head began to turn slowly, like it was moving through molasses, and I realized with growing horror that it was turning too far, past the normal range of human neck rotation, approaching the impossible 180-degree mark that should have snapped vertebrae and severed arteries. When she finally faced me, I understood why the camp had been abandoned, why the records had been sealed, and why my grandmother had always crossed herself when she drove past the turnoff to Whispering Pines Road. The little girl's face was a ruin of decay and corruption, her eye sockets empty except for writhing masses of what looked like pale worms, her mouth a gaping hole filled with broken teeth that had grown too long and sharp for any human jaw. But worst of all was her voice when she spoke, sweet and musical and perfectly innocent, as if death and corruption were just costume makeup she could wash off at the end of the day. "We've been waiting for you, Mr. Luke," she said, and her words came out in a sing-song cadence that children use when they're reciting nursery rhymes. "The master said you'd come looking, just like the others. Would you like to play with us? We have such wonderful games to show you." As she spoke, more children began emerging from the abandoned cabins, a dozen small figures in various states of decay and decomposition, all wearing the same summer camp t-shirts, all moving with the jerky, unnatural gait of marionettes controlled by a drunk puppeteer. My hand moved instinctively back to my service weapon, but before I could draw it, the blonde girl was standing directly in front of me, having covered 20 feet of distance in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Up close, I could smell her. The sickly sweet odor of flowers at a funeral mixed with something else, something that reminded me of the basement of the old church where my mother used to drag me for Sunday school. Her small hand, cold as January creek water, reached up and touched my cheek with a gentleness that was absolutely terrifying in its sincerity. "The master needs more friends," she whispered, and I could feel her breath on my face, could see the writhing movement in her empty eye sockets as the worm things that had replaced her eyes turned their attention to me. "He's been so lonely since the camp closed, but now you're here and you brought us a present." She gestured toward something behind me, and when I turned around, my heart nearly stopped completely. Noah Bennett was hanging upside down from a tree branch about 50 yards away, his arms bound behind his back with what looked like old camp rope, his mouth gagged with a strip of cloth that might have once been part of a summer camp bandana. But he was alive. I could see his chest rising and falling, could see his eyes wide with terror as he stared at me and tried to scream through his gag. Blood had pooled in his head from hanging inverted for what might have been hours or days, turning his face a dangerous purple red that meant brain damage wasn't far away. "Noah!" I shouted, starting to run toward him, but the dead children moved to block my path with supernatural speed and coordination. They formed a perfect semicircle around me, their rotting faces turned up to mine with expressions of eager anticipation, like they were waiting for me to perform a magic trick at their birthday party. The blonde girl, who seemed to be their spokesperson, clasped her hands together in delight and bounced on her toes, a motion that made her head wobble sickeningly on her damaged neck. "Oh, you know our new friend's name," she exclaimed with genuine enthusiasm. "That makes the game so much more fun when everyone knows each other. The master will be so pleased that you care about Noah. He does his best work with people who care deeply, who have strong emotional connections to their friends and family." The way she said emotional connections made it sound like she was discussing ingredients for a recipe, and I realized with growing horror, that's probably exactly what they were to whatever entity controlled these undead children. Behind the semicircle of rotting kids, I could see Noah struggling more frantically, his muffled screams becoming more desperate as he realized that his rescue had just become his executioner's front row seat to whatever sick ritual these things had planned. My radio crackled with Sarah's voice. "Unit 17, what's your status? We lost your signal for a few minutes." I grabbed the radio with shaking hands, but before I could respond, the blonde girl reached up and plucked it from my grip with casual ease, then crushed it between her small fingers like it was made of tissue paper. "No interruptions during playtime," she said with the patient tone of a kindergarten teacher explaining the rules. "The master doesn't like when grown-ups try to spoil our fun. Now, would you like to hear about the games we've been playing with your friend Noah?" She gestured again toward the hanging figure, and I could see now that Noah's clothing had been cut away in places, revealing wounds that had been carved with surgical precision, symbols and patterns that hurt to look at directly, as if my brain was rejecting the visual input as incompatible with sanity. The other children began to giggle, a sound like breaking glass mixed with the whistle of wind through cemetery trees, and I realized that this wasn't random sadism or the work of a human monster. This was worship, ritual, sacrifice to something that fed on pain and terror and the corruption of innocence. The children weren't just victims, they were converts, willing servants who had been promised eternal playmates in exchange for their souls and their flesh. "The master comes when the moon is dark," the blonde girl continued, her empty socket somehow managing to convey intense excitement despite the absence of actual eyes. "Tonight is the new moon, which means it's time for Noah to become one of us. Isn't that wonderful? He'll never have to worry about growing old or paying taxes or any of those boring grown-up things. He'll stay young forever just like us." The other children applauded with their rotting hands, some of which were missing fingers or entire sections of palm. I looked past them to where Noah hung like a piece of meat in a butcher shop and saw something that made my analytical mind start working again despite the supernatural terror, trying to shut down all rational thought. The rope holding him was old, probably from the original camp supplies, which meant it had been weathering for over 30 years. The branch it was thrown over showed signs of stress fractures from repeated use. This wasn't Noah's first time hanging there. They'd been practicing, perfecting their technique, probably on small animals or maybe other missing hikers whose disappearances had never been solved. But most importantly, the knots were tied wrong. Whoever had bound Noah had used a basic square knot instead of a proper hangman's noose or even a bowline hitch. If I could get close enough, if I could distract these dead children for just a few seconds, I might be able to cut him down and make a run for it. The problem was that supernatural speed and coordination they'd displayed, normal human reflexes wouldn't be fast enough to outmaneuver entities that could move between heartbeats. That's when I remembered the one advantage I'd always had over my fellow rangers. I actually read the training manuals, including the sections on local folklore and historical incidents that everyone else skipped over as irrelevant background information. And buried in a 1987 incident report filed by the last camp director, I'd found a reference to something called the binding words, a phrase that allegedly could compel the dead children to stop moving for exactly 60 seconds. The camp director had written it off as superstitious nonsense from terrified campers, but he'd included the phrase in his report anyway. "Children of the silent playground, I call you home to rest." It was supposed to be said 3 times while facing west, toward the setting sun that would never again warm their corrupted flesh. It sounded like New Age bullshit mixed with half-remembered Sunday school lessons. But at this point I was willing to try anything short of prayer, and frankly, I wasn't ruling prayer out either. "Before we play," I said loudly, trying to project confidence I absolutely didn't feel, "I need to ask you something important. Are you the children of the silent playground?" The blonde girl's head tilted to one side with curiosity, but the other kids stopped their giggling and turned their attention fully to me. Something in the way they focused suggested that I'd said something significant, something that resonated with whatever passed for their consciousness. "How do you know those words?" the blonde girl asked, and for the first time since this nightmare began, she sounded uncertain, almost afraid. "Only the camp counselors knew those words, and they're all dead now. The master made sure of that." Her empty socket seemed to bore into me with renewed intensity. and I could feel the attention of something much larger and more malevolent focusing on our conversation like a spotlight made of pure malice. I turned to face west, toward where the sun would set in about 10 hours if I lived long enough to see it, and spoke the words with as much authority as I could muster. Children of the silent playground, I call you home to rest. Children of the silent playground, I call you home to rest. Children of the silent playground, I call you home to rest. The effect was immediate and terrifying. All 12 of the dead children froze in place like someone had paused a DVD, their bodies locked in mid-motion, their expressions unchanged but somehow vacant, as if their consciousness had been temporarily switched off. I had 60 seconds, maybe less if my memory of the incident report was wrong. I sprinted toward Noah, pulling my emergency knife from my belt as I ran, my boots slipping on the frost-slick leaves but somehow maintaining traction through sheer desperation. Noah's eyes widened when he saw me coming, and he tried to say something through his gag, but there was no time for communication. I sliced through the rope with 2 quick cuts, catching him as he fell and nearly dislocating my shoulder in the process. He was heavier than he looked, dead weight from hanging upside down for hours, and when I pulled the gag from his mouth, his first words were barely a whisper. "Luke? Jesus Christ, Luke. They're not human. They're not fucking human." Blood was streaming from his nose and ears from the prolonged inversion, and when I helped him to his feet, he swayed like a drunk man trying to walk a straight line. "Can you run?" I asked, already knowing we didn't have a choice either way. Behind us, I could hear the children beginning to stir, their supernatural paralysis wearing off faster than I'd hoped. The blonde girl's voice rose in what might have been anger or excitement. "That wasn't very nice, Mr. Luke. Now we'll have to play the rough games." The sound of small feet moving through dead leaves was getting closer, and Noah's weight against my shoulder told me he wasn't going to be winning any foot races in his current condition. We stumbled through the forest like a 3-legged race team, crashing through underbrush and tripping over fallen logs, while behind us the children's laughter grew louder and more distorted. Noah kept mumbling something about the master in the basement and symbols that move on their own. But I couldn't focus on his words while trying to navigate by the dim light of dawn filtering through the canopy. My GPS was dead, my radio was destroyed, and we were being hunted through 89,000 acres of wilderness by supernatural entities that knew every tree, every trail, every hiding place. That's when I remembered the old service road that connected to Highway 12. If we could reach it, if we could get to my truck parked at the trailhead, we might have a chance of escaping this nightmare and getting Noah to a hospital. The road was approximately 2 miles southwest of our current position, but the terrain between here and there included 2 steep ravines and a section of deadfall that would slow us down significantly. Against normal human pursuers, we might have made it. Against things that could move faster than human eyes could track, our odds were somewhere between slim and non-existent. But we ran anyway, because the alternative was becoming part of whatever sick collection those dead children were assembling for their master. Noah's condition improved slightly as blood flow returned to his brain, and soon he was able to support more of his own weight, though he still leaned heavily on my shoulder. "They showed me things," he gasped between breaths. "In the basement under the lodge. Bones arranged in patterns, symbols carved into the walls, and something else, something that wasn't quite dead but wasn't alive either." The first ravine appeared ahead of us, a 15-foot drop into a creek bed filled with jagged rocks and fallen timber. Without rope or proper equipment, it would normally be a challenging but manageable descent for an experienced hiker. In our current state, running from supernatural predators while supporting an injured man, it looked like certain death. But behind us, the children's voices were getting closer, and I could hear them singing now. A twisted version of "Ring Around the Rosie" that ended with "We all fall down and stay down forever." I went first, testing each foothold and handhold, while Noah lowered himself behind me, both of us moving as quickly as we dared while trying not to break our necks on the descent. Halfway down, my boot slipped on a moss-covered rock, and I slid the last 8 feet on my ass, tearing my uniform pants and scraping enough skin off my back to paint a small fence. Noah's descent was more controlled but also more painful, as his circulation hadn't fully returned and his muscles kept cramping. We'd just reached the creek bed when the children appeared at the top of the ravine, silhouetted against the growing daylight like a photo negative of innocent childhood. But instead of following our path down, they simply stepped off the edge and fell the 15 feet without showing any sign of impact or injury. Their bodies hit the rocks with wet, meaty sounds, but they stood up immediately and began walking toward us with that same jerky, unnatural gait. "Fuck," Noah whispered, and I had to agree with his assessment of our situation. We were trapped in a narrow creek bed with steep sides on both flanks, and our pursuers had just demonstrated that basic laws of physics didn't apply to them. Our only option was to follow the creek downstream toward where it intersected with the old service road, hoping we could stay ahead of them long enough to reach my truck. The creek bed was an obstacle course of slippery rocks, fallen logs, and ice-cold water that soaked through our boots within the first 50 yards. Noah's injured condition made him clumsy, and twice he went down hard, once cutting his hand open on a piece of broken glass that some long-ago litter bug had thrown into the water. But we kept moving, because stopping meant facing whatever the dead children had planned for us, and I'd seen enough of their handiwork carved into Noah's flesh to know that death would be a mercy compared to their idea of games. Behind us, I could hear them splashing through the water, but they weren't moving as quickly as they had on dry land. Maybe the running water had some effect on their supernatural abilities, or maybe they were just being cautious about the unstable footing. Either way, it was the first piece of good luck we'd had since this nightmare began, and I wasn't going to waste it by looking a gift horse in the mouth. The second ravine was shallower but wider, and by the time we climbed out of the creek bed, both of us were hypothermic and exhausted. Noah was shivering so hard he could barely speak, and my own coordination was shot from the combination of adrenaline crash and cold exposure. But I could see the old service road through the trees ahead, and beyond that, the metallic glint of my Ford F-150's bumper reflecting the morning sun. We'd made it maybe 100 yards when Noah collapsed completely, his legs simply refusing to carry him any further. "Go," he whispered through chattering teeth. "Get help. Leave me." It was the kind of noble sacrifice that worked great in movies but made no practical sense in real life. I wasn't leaving an injured civilian behind to be recaptured by supernatural entities, partly because it violated every principle of Ranger ethics, but mostly because I'd never be able to face his mother again if I came back without her son. "Fuck that," I said, hauling him to his feet and slinging his arm over my shoulder. "We're both getting out of here, or neither of us is." It was probably the most unprofessional thing I'd ever said on duty, but these weren't exactly normal working conditions. Noah managed a weak smile and got his feet moving again, though I was basically carrying 3/4 of his body weight by this point. The children emerged from the forest behind us just as we reached the service road, their clothes now soaked and muddy from the creek crossing, but their expressions still radiating that same eager anticipation. The blonde girl raised her hand in a cheerful wave as if she were saying goodbye to friends after a pleasant playdate, and called out in her sweet musical voice, "Don't go yet, Mr. Luke. The master wants to meet you. He has so many wonderful things to show you." My truck was 50 yards away, the keys in my pocket, the engine reliable enough to start in any weather conditions short of absolute zero. But 50 yards might as well have been 50 miles if those things could move at supernatural speeds. I made a decision that probably violated several department regulations and definitely violated common sense. I drew my service weapon and fired 3 rounds into the air, the sharp cracks echoing through the forest like thunder. The children stopped moving, their heads tilted in unison as they processed this new development. "Oh," the blonde girl exclaimed with delight. "You have a noisemaker. We love noisemakers. They make such interesting sounds when they hit different things." She began walking toward us again, but now the other children were spreading out, trying to flank us from both sides of the road. I fired again, this time putting 2 rounds center mass into the blonde girl's chest. The bullets punched through her rotting flesh with wet, tearing sounds, but she didn't even stumble. Instead, she looked down at the holes in her summer camp t-shirt with mild curiosity, poked one of them with her finger, then looked back up at me with an expression of patient disappointment. "That was very rude, Mr. Luke," she said sadly. "The master doesn't like it when people are rude to his children. Now we'll have to tell him that you weren't polite during playtime." The other children had completed their flanking maneuver and were now blocking both directions along the service road. We were surrounded, outnumbered, and apparently outgunned by enemies that bullets couldn't stop. That's when I heard the most beautiful sound in the world, the growl of a diesel engine coming up the service road from the highway. A Park Service maintenance truck rounded the bend, its driver probably responding to my gunshots, and I started waving my arms and shouting like a madman. The truck slowed, then stopped, and Ranger Tom Kowalski got out with his hand on his weapon. "Patterson? What the hell are you—" Tom's words died in his throat as he saw the circle of children surrounding us. But instead of supernatural horror, his expression showed only confusion. Where did all these kids come from? Is this some kind of school field trip that wasn't on the schedule? I looked back and forth between Tom and the dead children, my brain struggling to process what was happening. Tom was seeing them as normal kids, probably healthy and alive and innocent looking. The supernatural decay, the empty eye sockets, the impossible movements, none of that was visible to him. Whatever force animated these creatures was projecting a glamour, a false image that made them appear harmless to anyone who wasn't already aware of their true nature. "Tom," I said carefully, trying not to sound like I'd completely lost my mind. "Those aren't normal children. Radio for backup. Radio for everyone we've got. And whatever you do, don't let them get close to you." Tom's expression shifted from confusion to concern, but I could see he was worried about my mental state rather than any actual threat from a group of apparently normal kids. The blonde girl took advantage of the distraction to skip closer to Tom's truck, her movements now appearing perfectly natural and innocent to his eyes. "Hi, mister," she called out in her sweet voice. "We're lost. Can you help us find our parents? We've been looking for them for ever so long." Tom's hand moved away from his weapon, and I could see him starting to relax as his protective instincts toward children overrode his caution. "Don't listen to her," I shouted, raising my gun again. "Tom, get back in your truck right now." But Tom was already walking toward the blonde girl, his expression softening with concern and parental instinct. He knelt down to her eye level, putting himself in perfect position for whatever attack she had planned. And I realized I was about to watch a good man die, because my warning sounded like the ravings of someone in the middle of a psychotic break. The little girl reached up to touch Tom's face with that same gentle gesture she'd used on me. But this time I was close enough to see what happened when her skin made contact with his. Tom's expression didn't change immediately, but I watched the color drain from his face like someone had opened a valve in his neck. His eyes remained focused and alert, but his body began to sag as if his bones were slowly dissolving. "Tom." I grabbed Noah's arm and started dragging him toward the maintenance truck, hoping to reach the radio and call for backup before whatever poison the girl had transmitted finished its work. But Tom was already falling backward, his body convulsing as something that looked like black veins began spreading outward from where she'd touched him. His mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, but no sound came out except for a wet, gurgling noise that suggested his lungs were filling with fluid. The blonde girl stood up and clapped her hands together with genuine joy. "Oh, this one's going to be so much fun. The master loves it when they fight the change. It makes the final conversion so much sweeter." The other children gathered around Tom's twitching body, with the eager attention of students watching a particularly interesting science experiment. His convulsions grew stronger, and I could hear his bones breaking under the strain of muscles contracting beyond human limits. I reached the truck and lunged for the radio handset, but before I could key the microphone, Noah grabbed my arm. "Don't," he whispered urgently. "Whatever signal you send out, they'll be able to track it. They'll know exactly where to find us, and they'll send more people to become like them." He was right, of course. Calling for backup would just be feeding more victims to whatever entity controlled these creatures. Instead, I threw the truck into reverse and floored the accelerator, hoping to put some distance between us and the children before they finished whatever they were doing to Tom. Through the rear window, I could see his body arching off the ground in a final, impossible spasm, then going completely limp. But as we drove away, I also saw him beginning to sit up, his movements now carrying that same jerky, unnatural quality as the dead children. We made it to Highway 12 without any signs of pursuit, and I pushed the maintenance truck to its maximum speed, heading toward the ranger station. Noah had stopped shivering and was looking more alert, though the cuts and symbols carved into his skin were still bleeding steadily. "We need to get you to a hospital," I told him, but he shook his head. "No hospital," he said firmly. "Whatever they did to me, whatever those symbols mean, a hospital won't be able to help. We need to find someone who understands this kind of thing, someone who knows about the old camp, about what really happened there in 1987. He pulled out his damaged satellite phone and somehow managed to get it working long enough to make a single call. "Professor Martinez? It's Noah Bennett. Yes, I know what time it is. No, I'm not drunk. Professor, I need you to tell me everything you know about the Whispering Pines summer camp incident. Everything you didn't put in your published papers about local folklore." There was a long pause, and I could hear an elderly woman's voice on the other end speaking rapidly in Spanish mixed with English. When Noah finally hung up, his expression was grim. "Professor Martinez has been researching occult activity in the Pacific Northwest for 40 years. She says the camp was built on a site that local tribes considered cursed, where they used to leave criminals and outcasts to die. The camp counselors in 1987 weren't just victims, they were participants in some kind of ritual that was supposed to grant them power over life and death." "And the children?" I asked, though I was pretty sure I already knew the answer. "The children were the sacrifice. 12 kids, all between the ages of 6 and 10, all killed in a specific pattern designed to open a doorway for something called the Shepherd of Lost Innocence. The entity that came through that doorway took the children's bodies and turned them into collectors, gatherers of souls for some larger purpose that Professor Martinez couldn't identify from the historical records." We reached the ranger station 23 minutes later, but as soon as I saw the empty parking lot and the dark windows, I knew we were too late. The normal morning shift should have had 6 rangers and 2 administrative staff members present by 8:30 a.m., but there wasn't a single vehicle in sight. The front door was standing open, swaying gently in the morning breeze, and I could smell that same sickly sweet funeral scent drifting out from inside. "They work fast," Noah observed with the flat tone of someone who had already processed too much trauma for one day. "How long were we in the forest? 3 hours? 4 hours?" I checked my watch and realized it had stopped at 7:17 a.m., probably right around the time the blonde girl had touched my radio and crushed it with her bare hands. Time distortion was apparently another side effect of supernatural encounters, along with the growing certainty that we were the only 2 people left alive who knew the truth about what was happening in Pine Ridge National Forest. We couldn't go back to the forest, that would be suicide. We couldn't stay at the ranger station, that would be walking into a trap. And we couldn't call for outside help without potentially spreading the contamination to whatever law enforcement agencies responded. We were effectively on our own. 2 exhausted and traumatized men against an entity that had been collecting souls for over 30 years and had just demonstrated its ability to convert adult humans into supernatural servants within a matter of minutes. "Professor Martinez gave me an address," Noah said, pulling a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket. "She says there's someone in Seattle who might be able to help, someone who has experience with this type of entity. But Luke," he paused, and when he looked at me, his eyes held a depth of horror that I'd never seen in another human being. "She also said that once you've been marked by the shepherd, once you've had direct contact with its servants, it never stops hunting you. Even if we get away from here, even if we manage to warn people about what's happening, we'll never be safe again." I thought about Tom Kowalski, a good man with 3 kids and a wife who made the best apple pie in the county, now converted into another supernatural servant. I thought about the other rangers who should have been at the station this morning, probably meeting the same fate. I thought about Noah's mother, waiting by her phone for news about her son, not knowing that her prayers had been answered in the worst possible way. And then I thought about the symbols carved into Noah's flesh, still bleeding after hours of exposure to cold air, still radiating a heat that had nothing to do with infection or inflammation. Whatever mark the shepherd had placed on us, whatever connection had been forged during our contact with its servants, we were carrying it with us wherever we went. We weren't just survivors, we were vectors, potential spreading points for a contamination that could eventually consume every person we cared about. Then we make sure it ends with us, I said, starting the truck's engine again. We find this contact in Seattle, we learn how to stop the shepherd, and we go back to finish what we started. Because those dead children aren't going to stay content with picking off isolated hikers and park rangers. Eventually, they're going to expand their hunting grounds. Eventually, they're going to go after families, schools, entire communities. Noah nodded, understanding the mathematics of supernatural predation as clearly as I did. How long do you think we have before it spreads beyond the forest? I thought about the empty ranger station, about the speed with which Tom had been converted, about the eager anticipation in the dead children's voices when they talked about their master's plans. Maybe days, maybe hours. Maybe we're already too late and just don't know it yet. The truck's headlights cut through the growing dusk as we drove away from Pine Ridge National Forest, two marked men racing against time and supernatural forces to prevent an apocalypse that had been 30 years in the making. Behind us, the forest was already beginning to change. Animals were fleeing in unprecedented numbers, following instincts older than human civilization that warned them of approaching corruption. The trees themselves seemed to be withdrawing their life force, preparing for a spiritual winter that might never end. And somewhere in the ruins of an abandoned summer camp, 12 dead children were singing lullabies to an entity that fed on innocence and grew stronger with every soul it claimed. We had maybe one chance to stop it, one desperate gamble based on the word of an elderly professor, and the hope that somewhere in Seattle, someone understood enough about supernatural predation to arm us with weapons that could actually hurt the shepherd of lost innocence. But as we drove through the night toward an uncertain dawn, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't racing to save the world. We were racing to choose how it would end. Holy hell, that was intense. Did that ending blow your mind? Like, if you want more terrifying ranger stories, follow for daily supernatural horror, and comment your theory about what really happened to Noah Bennett. I read every single one.